My name is Emily Brooks, and until 3 hours ago, I was the Senior Risk and Compliance Officer at Titan Freight and Logistics. For 15 years, I built the systems that kept our supply chains running, negotiated insurance terms most executives didn't bother to read, and tested every contingency plan until it bled into muscle memory. I didn't chase headlines or boardroom spotlight. I built quiet, resilient order in a company obsessed with speed. That morning, the breach hit just before sunrise. Containers rerouted themselves in the tracking system, invoices duplicated, some vanished, and delivery routes in Dallas and Charlotte froze without explanation. I was deep in the system, 3 monitors open and toggling between our vendor network and internal compliance flags. My headset buzzed with crosstalk from legal operations and external partners demanding answers. Every second counted. The room smelled like coffee and tension. Connor Redford, our new CEO, stood at the head of the war room like he'd watched too many action films. He was all posture and bravado, fresh from the sports world, and still believing charisma could patch over technical debt. But this wasn't a locker room, and I wasn't a junior staffer. I'd just confirmed that the disruption matched a vulnerability I flagged 2 quarters ago when his voice cut through the air like a knife. He said my name, sharp and too loud. I looked up, half thinking he wanted a status update. Instead, he told me to log out and hand over my badge. My fingers froze on the keyboard. At first, I thought it was some kind of test, a leadership stunt to grab attention. I blinked, confused. Then he said it again, louder, slower. "You're done here." That's when the room went silent. People around me stopped typing. No one moved. Someone on the call from Chicago whispered, asking if their line had gone dead. I stood still for a beat, then leaned forward to double-check the system log, thinking maybe I'd misheard him. My console blinked. Session timed out. Access revoked. I wasn't just being removed from the crisis. I was being erased. My credentials were already gone overwritten in real time while alerts still screamed across the screen. Someone near me gasped. Someone else looked away. I didn't. I closed the laptop, picked up my badge, and rose from the chair I had occupied for over a decade. The air felt thin. My heart wasn't racing. It was slowing deliberately, like my body knew what dignity required. Connor's nephew stood by the door holding a tablet like a prop he didn't understand. His smirk flickered when I met his eyes. I walked past him without a word. There were no protests, no last arguments. I wasn't going to beg for the right to keep cleaning up their mistakes, but I'll never forget the sound my badge made when it failed at the elevator. One short, sharp beep. Denied. I stood there for a second alone, surrounded by people pretending to focus on their screens. I swiped the badge again. Another beep. Same result. I set it on the console carefully, as if it were something fragile that no longer belonged to me. Behind me, the war room returned to motion. Voices resumed, but quieter, less certain. I was already history. My name wasn't even spoken again, just scrubbed from the logs like a deleted file. But outside, I still had my name. And my memory. And a rising, quiet fury that I wouldn't let go of. Not yet. Not after everything I'd built. Not after the way they let it collapse. I used to believe loyalty was the one currency that never lost value. For 15 years, I gave Titan Freight everything I had. Not because they asked for it, but because I thought it mattered. There were years when I barely saw my family on Thanksgiving. I once missed my daughter's first piano recital because a vendor audit in Phoenix had spiraled into a compliance risk. My husband had texted me a blurry photo of her on stage in a white dress, and I'd stared at it on my hotel bed like it could rewind time. I can still remember the smell of stale coffee in the Dallas data center, where I once spent 2 nights sleeping on a fold-out chair while we updated our cross-border tracking system. The janitor thought I was part of the night crew. I laughed, then told him I liked the quiet. But the truth is, I thought I was building something that would outlast me. Systems that ran clean risks, that stayed managed contracts, that wouldn't unravel when real pressure came. I believed in the foundation even when the leadership shifted every few years. I believed it would mean something. Now it feels naive. All that effort, all those nights. They didn't just take me for granted. They tossed me out like I was a liability the moment I stopped fitting their optics. One time I drove 6 hours through a snowstorm to personally deliver backup protocols to a client after our cloud sync failed. I didn't even ask for reimbursement. I just wanted us to keep our name clean. I wore that name like armor, but standing in that elevator lobby badge denied my name, didn't open doors anymore. 15 years gone in 2 words. You're done. Not even the decency of a conversation behind closed doors. Just performance staged for effect. I gave up weekends, birthdays, and vacations. I was the one who remembered who had which password when no one else did. The one who signed off on risk thresholds at midnight so shipping lanes wouldn't grind to a halt. And yet when it came time to stand beside me, they all looked away. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being erased. That's what I felt in those minutes after being fired. Like I had poured everything into a well I thought would hold me, only to realize it was a hole waiting to bury me. I stood at the elevator badge in hand, hoping muscle memory might override reality. The red light blinked back at me like a warning I didn't want to believe. I tried again, slower this time, like the system might show mercy if I asked more gently. Behind me, no one moved. The war room buzzed with artificial urgency, but the tension had shifted. No longer about the breach. Now it was about what to do with the silence I had left behind. My screen had gone dark minutes earlier. 1 second I was inside the network running a protocol to contain vendor exposure, and the next everything disappeared. Session expired. Credentials not found. My existence professionally had been deleted. Someone near the window coughed. Someone else shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. Eyes flicked toward me and then away, like I was suddenly radioactive. My name no longer had a chair in that room. I picked up my laptop bag not because I had any work left to do, but because it gave my hands something to hold. My palms were dry. My steps were quiet. Even my heels felt unsure on the tile I'd walked across for over a decade. As I passed the IT pod, one of the junior engineers glanced up. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just looked down again and kept typing. I didn't blame him. Cowards and survivors often look the same in real time. My badge was still in my hand when I reached the glass doors. I knew they wouldn't open, but I tapped it out of habit. Nothing happened. No beep this time. Just glass. Security watched from behind their station. I'd trained half of them, picked the vendor who ran their threat assessments. They didn't acknowledge me. The hallway felt longer than it ever had. Fluorescent lights overhead hummed with indifference. I caught my reflection in the glass jaw set eyes, sharp. Not angry, not defeated. Just hollowed out. That's what humiliation feels like when it's public and precise. It doesn't shout, it carves. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just kept walking. Because there's nothing left to defend when the system that once relied on you pretends you were never there. By the time I reached the parking garage, I couldn't remember if anyone had actually said goodbye. Maybe they thought I'd come back. Maybe they hoped I wouldn't. Either way, none of them followed. The Texas heat wrapped around me like punishment the moment I stepped out. I walked without a destination, crossing the street in a daze, the Titan Tower still looming behind me like a monument built on borrowed loyalty. Every window reflected sunlight, cold and hard, like the place had already scrubbed me from its memory. I found a coffee shop across the street, half empty, cool inside, with the hum of an espresso machine and a cashier who didn't recognize me. That small mercy made it easier to sit in the corner without speaking. I ordered something I didn't taste and watched the building that used to feel like home. The news hadn't broken yet, but the cracks were showing. I saw a logistics director rush out, phone pressed to his ear, face pale. A courier from legal came back empty-handed. Someone near the lobby argued with security, gesturing toward their badge reader, frustrated. Inside that building, I had trained people to stay calm during emergencies. Not with bravado or slogans, but with systems that worked. I had run tabletop simulations, worst-case scenarios, and insurance failovers. I knew every fire escape, every weak link, and now I sat outside, unable to help watching them scramble toward failure I had warned them was coming. The rage came slowly. It wasn't loud or righteous. It was quiet and methodical, like the way a virus slips past a firewall because someone ignored the update. I sipped the coffee. It was bitter and burned my tongue. I didn't mind. Across the cafe, a screen was showing muted business news. Ticker symbols rolled by unbothered. For now, part of me wanted to walk back in and fix it, to push aside the ego and panic and take my seat again. Because no matter how badly they treated me, I still knew the system better than anyone in that room. My fingers itched for the keyboard, but I didn't move. Because the other part of me, the one that still remembered how Connor's voice sounded when he fired me, knew this wasn't just a misstep. This was intentional. I wasn't left behind. I was pushed out. And in that push, they had severed the one connection that mattered most. My access. The irony was almost funny. They had made me the single point of authorization for most of Titan's insurance triggers, a control measure to prevent accidental exposure. And then they removed me in the middle of the very scenario those protections were built. I watched another group rush into the building, led by someone from operations. They didn't look up. No one did. From this side of the glass, I could have been anyone, a customer, a temp, a ghost. I checked my phone. No messages, no apologies, just a silent inbox that echoed what I already knew. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because they chose to stop seeing me. And that hurt more than any insult. More than the badge denial, more than the silence in the war room. I had bled for that place. They had watched me bleed. And when the moment came, they turned their heads. But as I sat in that booth, the anger didn't harden into hate. It settled into something colder, something that waited. Because if there's one thing I learned from a lifetime in risk, it's this: consequences don't arrive when you expect them, but they always arrive. Inside Titan, the war room had turned from controlled urgency into full-scale panic. The IT dashboard was a wall of red alerts cascading down faster than anyone could track. Freight data routes were collapsing in sequence, and warehouse systems in 3 states had already frozen. Legal tried to file an emergency activation of the insurance clause. That's when the second failure landed. The system rejected the request, citing missing authorization from the compliance officer of record. Someone shouted across the room to try again. Another tapped keys, faster, searching for overrides. But the result was the same. Authorization required. No access granted. Connor paced like a caged animal, demanding to know why it wasn't working. The room stayed quiet until one of the senior analysts spoke up. She read aloud from the policy metadata, voice shaking. The clause required single-point biometric verification, assigned to one person, Emily Brooks. The name hit like a dropped anchor. People stopped moving. A few exchanged looks. Others stared at their screens, pretending not to hear. Connor refused to believe it. He barked at the IT lead to bypass the restriction, get in another way. Override it with admin rights. But the lock didn't care about titles. It was built into the architecture. It had been my idea. Months earlier, I had submitted a compliance proposal after our reinsurer flagged Titan's outdated risk redundancy. I drafted a safeguard system tied to biometric verification, only to be used during high-risk breaches. I had recommended dual signatures, a second officer for fallback, but Connor had called it bloated. Unnecessary. He wanted to trim overhead, simplify protocols. I remembered the meeting. His exact words were still burned into memory. Why pay for 2 approvals when we trust one person? Emily's always available. Always. Until the moment he fired me. Now the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It had activated the deep clause. Without my signature, nothing could move. No funds. No insurance. No restoration. Back in the war room, the truth was settling in like smoke. Not a crash, a suffocation. Executives started making calls, trying to reach the underwriter, trying to find a loophole. but the documents were clear. I was removed mid-incident. Without my validation, the protection was void. Someone found the report I had filed, the one who laid out this scenario in detail, a dozen pages time-stamped with a red cover that said "Urgent" in bold font. It had sat in the board's inbox for weeks, unread. Connor demanded to know why no one had stopped this. His nephew blamed the policy team. Someone tried to say I had done it on purpose, but the timeline didn't lie. The code executed itself the moment my credentials were revoked. One executive whispered that the insurance clause was now a dead letter. The CFO looked sick. From across the street, I couldn't hear the shouting, but I could see the pacing, the flurry of movement. The moment heads dropped into hands, and I knew. It had finally clicked. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't betrayal. This was a consequence, and it had arrived right on time. The moment came in a single page printed from the internal HR system and dropped onto the center of the boardroom table like a loaded weapon. Someone read the timestamp aloud. 10:03 a.m. That was the exact moment the insurance lockout had triggered. The silence was instant. No one moved, no one spoke. The head of legal stared at the document, lips pressed tight. The CFO sank back in his chair, hands trembling slightly at the edge of the armrest. The board chair took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes like he was hoping the numbers might change if he blinked long enough. It was all there. The termination order was signed by Connor Redford. Emily Brooks. Access revoked. Status terminated. Effective immediately. Across the table, a compliance officer pulled up the breach timeline. She didn't need to say anything. Everyone could see it. The breach peaked at 10:04. By then, the system had already sealed itself. Outside the boardroom, news had started to trickle out. A leaked internal memo. A single tweet. Then the press picked it up. Screens across the building lit up with headlines. Insurance claim denied. The CEO terminated the officer during a live breach. Someone tried to say it was a coincidence. Someone else tried to question the timestamp's accuracy. But the system's log was final. Immutable. Tied to internal authentication protocols. There was no room for doubt. The damage wasn't just technical anymore. It was reputational and public. The reporters outside didn't know the full story yet, but they knew enough. Photos of Connor entering the war room that morning were already circulating. One of them is smiling. Another showing him walking past Emily without acknowledging her. Inside the board sat in stunned stillness. The truth wasn't dramatic or shouted. It was printed in black ink, sitting quietly in the middle of the table. Connor stared at the page like it had betrayed him, but it hadn't. It had simply remembered what he did and when. Data doesn't have opinions. It only tells you what happened. And on that morning at 10:03 a.m., the CEO of Titan Freight had cut off the only person who could have saved them. The collapse didn't begin with a hacker. It began with a signature. The board didn't raise its voice. They didn't need to. One by one, they turned their chairs toward Connor and made it clear. His position was no longer tenable. The chair of the audit committee spoke first, voice low and steady. They had begun coordinating with federal regulators before the timestamp even surfaced. Now they would handle the company's exposure without him. Connor tried to speak, but no one listened. His authority was gone, not because of anger, but because the room had outgrown the illusion that he was in control. They had seen the cost of trusting charisma over competence. The CFO made the motion official, effective immediately. Connor Redford was removed as CEO. The legal team began drafting statements while the press gathered outside hungrier by the minute. Meanwhile, I sat in the back corner of that same coffee shop, unaware of the exact moment his title disappeared. My phone buzzed quietly against the tabletop. Unknown number, Washington, D.C. The message was brief. A senior officer from the Department of Transportation had reviewed my compliance filings. They wanted to speak, not as an interview, as an invitation. They had read the report I filed 6 months ago, the one the board ignored, the one Connor never opened. The caller said it was one of the most forward-thinking risk assessments they had ever reviewed. I didn't answer right away. I let the words sink in. Outside the cafe window, I watched a local news van pull up to the Titan building. Microphones were already pointed toward the revolving doors. For the first time in hours, my shoulders dropped, not in defeat, in release. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was something quieter. The restoration of my name spoken now by people who understood its weight. Titan Freight hadn't just lost its leadership. It had lost the chance to see what it had until it was too late. But someone else saw. Someone read past the headlines and found the work buried beneath them. And this time, they didn't want to exploit it. They wanted to elevate it. The fall of that tower wasn't mine to fix anymore. But what came after might be. The building wasn't tall or flashy, no glass tower or digital signs, just clean lines, quiet hallways, and a reception area where people looked up when you entered. My name was already on the list. The security guard smiled as he handed me a temporary badge. I walked through without hesitation, but not without feeling the difference. This place didn't ask for performance. It asked for precision. And I had learned the value of that the hard way. The office they assigned me wasn't large, but the windows let in natural light, and the desk was empty, waiting for a system I could shape from the ground up. It didn't smell like panic or stale ambition. It smelled like new beginnings. I stood for a moment before unpacking. My old watch still sat at the bottom of my bag, the same one I wore during the longest nights at Titan Freight. I held it in my hand, remembering the countless hours it marked as I tried to fix things no one understood. I set it on the shelf. Not as a keepsake, but as a boundary. That time was over. I didn't hate what happened. Not anymore. It took time to get here. The wounds were real, but they had become part of the foundation I now stood on. Titan had taught me how systems break. But it also taught me what resilience actually looks like, not the loud kind. The kind that rebuilds itself quietly, brick by brick. Outside the window, the street moved without urgency. A city at work. A world that didn't know who I was 2 months ago. Now I had a seat at a table that mattered. Not because I demanded it, because the work I did unseen, overlooked, finally spoke for itself. An assistant knocked once before bringing in a small plaque. She placed it on the desk with care. The steel caught the sunlight as I leaned in to read. Emily Brooks, Senior Advisor. Built on integrity, certified by truth. I didn't say anything. Just sat down and ran my fingers gently along the edge. This wasn't revenge. There was no need for that. This was something better. This was recognition. This was peace.